On Good Friday, we hear and see the mercy, charity, and compassion of God. We hear about that mercy, charity, and compassion being stretched beyond the limits of human comprehension in a singular act of love. And then as Jesus teaches from the cross, he exhorts us that we too must find ways to live out those same values of mercy, charity, and compassion. To embrace mercy, charity, and compassion, and to refuse to hate. This is the Good Friday task. So if Good Friday is about these things, why then is it so fraught with the ancient and poisonous hatred called anti-Semitism? Let me tell you about Hadrian. Hadrian was emperor of Rome from the years of 117 to 138. During his reign, he attempted to Romanize the mostly Jewish residents of Judea. His actions sparked a revolt in which many Jews lost their lives. There is at least one truly horrific story about Hadrian. One day, a Jew passed in front of him and greeted him. Hadrian said, "Who are you?" The man replied, "I am a Jew." The emperor said, "How dare a Jew pass in front of Hadrian and greet him?" And he ordered the man to be killed. Then another Jew passed in front of Hadrian, but as that man had seen what happened before, he said nothing. The emperor said, "Who are you?" The man replied, "A Jew." Hadrian then exclaimed, "How dare a Jew pass in front of Hadrian without giving a greeting?" And just as before, he ordered this man to be killed. The senator said to Hadrian, "We cannot understand your actions. He who greeted you was put to death, and he who did not greet you was put to death." Hadrian replied, "Do you dare to advise me how I am to deal with those I hate?" Sometimes hatred is just being blinded by our own irrationality. That terrible passage about Hadrian highlights the absurd and baseless nature of anti-Semitism. The insistent hatred of Jews is not about logic or reason. It's about regarding and treating those who are different from us with jealousy, disdain, paranoia, and willful violence. It's about having power and using power to our own ends and not to God's ends. And now, despite the baselessness of their belief, the acolytes of Hadrian continue to live on. They are stewards of an ancient hostility and prejudice. Today, you can see anti-Semitism being whistled in rallies and on the news and on bumper stickers, and most of all, in the warm anonymity of that vacuous scream hole we call the internet. Online, the algorithm just feeds us more of what we already like, very little of what challenges us. So if the hate feels good, then it can grow deeper on our own schedules with earbuds in while we fold laundry. The power of anti-Semitism in our time is that the dialogue around it has shifted and cooled, and some part of us now thinks it's okay to assume it as somehow normative. Every day, we should rise and beat back the beast of anti-Semitism, wherever and however we find it. But how? We could begin by being honest that Christians in particular have failed the Good Friday task. One obvious example, the 60 million Christians who lived in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. Some confessing Christians worked in opposition to Nazi thought, but many more allowed the creation of a Reich Church and acquiesced to Hitler's depiction of Christianity as the foundation for German values, even as he maintained that war would enable the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Again, it was not monolithic. Some Christians did aid and hide Jews in their greatest hour of need, and some boldly preached the truth of Scripture and condemned the destruction of their Jewish siblings, but they were in the minority. The man who would become Pope John the 23rd spent World War II working to save Jewish refugees of the Holocaust. In 1963, as he was near death, he wrote a prayer to God. We realize now that many, many centuries of blindness have dimmed our eyes, he wrote, so that we no longer see the beauty of thy chosen people and no longer recognize in their faces the features of our firstborn brother. Our brows are branded with the mark of Cain. Forgive us the curse which we unjustly laid on the name of the Jews. Forgive us that with our curse we crucified thee a second time. Just one drop of an example in a sea of pain. But as I say, a pain that has been particularly brought to bear on Good Fridays past. A small sampling. In the medieval era, a Good Friday chant called the Reproaches revved the crowd. It informed the people that Jews had rejected Jesus as the Messiah and crucified him instead. Good Friday, the year 1021 in Rome, an earthquake and a hurricane struck. Lives were lost. The Pope became persuaded that the cause of those disasters was Jews insulting the consecrated host while Christians were praying. Many Jews were found guilty and executed. Good Friday, 1349, Saxon Germany. A Christian girl entered a church and said she heard Jews plotting to attack Christians. Some Jews were jailed, but many more were burned at the stake with their families. And their synagogue was shuttered for the next 2 decades. The day after Good Friday, 1389, in Prague, the consecrated host was being processed down a road. Some anonymous children threw rocks at it. Christian clergy took to their pulpits and exhorted their flocks to exact vengeance. The ghetto was attacked, and 3,000 Jews were killed. And there are so many examples of anti-Semitic Good Friday preaching that cast blame and whipped up crowds and incited violence. Just as common as the reports from the Middle Age were civic and church decrees requiring Jews to stay in their homes on Good Friday or for several days thereafter, there was simply too much danger waiting just outside. This history comes to us along with the Bible. Perhaps the most damaging line of Scripture is that spoken by the crowd to Pilate in Matthew 27 when they demand to have Barabbas released. Pilate cannot find a reason to put Jesus to death, and he says so. Matthew says that the people reply that Jesus' blood can be upon them and their children. Matthew's gospel reflects the tensions between the Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus and the more conservative Jews they were separating from. But I do not believe that the author of Matthew could have possibly envisioned the many terrible ends this one verse would be put to over the centuries. Meanwhile, the Gospel of John throws the blame for Jesus' death onto the Jewish people. It shifts the fault off of the Roman authorities who made the decision and onto Jesus' own people. Surely you heard this today in the reading. John's gospel is similar to Matthew's in that lurking in the background is anger following a separation. Jesus-believing Jews have recently been expelled from the synagogue and are just writing down their thoughts in a theologized way that, although formal, is still emotionally raw. Okay, but does John mean to start 2 millennia of violence against the people of God? Of course not. In light of all these things, I believe that clergy and other liturgical ministers have a duty to preach against the sin of hatred every day, of course, but especially Good Friday, when we are aware of so much blood spilled by our Jewish siblings because of our own intolerance. After all, Jesus was one out of between 50,000 and 100,000 Jews who were crucified by the Romans in the first century. We need to be able to say with clarity and force, no more of this. No more. Let us agree to live to the standard of the Good Friday task.